Okay, welcome and good evening, everybody. We thinned out a few people from last week, but hopefully everybody's doing okay. Either ice and snow and cold or some ridiculous virus or something going on, who knows. So, yeah, right. All right, well, let's open in prayer and we'll get started. Well, Father God, we do thank you for every opportunity we have to gather in your name, to gather and to study your word. Lord God, I pray that each of us would have our hearts and our minds and our ears open to what you have to speak to us tonight, Lord God. We pray that your Holy Spirit would have absolute authority over everything we do and say, and that we would submit ourselves, our hearts, our minds, our bodies, and souls entirely to you and your will in everything that we do, Lord God. We just want to give you praise and thanks for it in Jesus' name. Amen. All righty, so we are in Esther, and we're right in kind of that middle section here. We're actually going to try to cover three. They're all relatively short chapters, and boy, you can't even imagine how short chapter 10 is. It's like 3 verses or 4 verses or something. So we won't go into that tonight, but we're going to try to cover three chapters. If it doesn't work, we'll get to that next week, but I felt like 2 was going to leave us a little too short, so... Plus, don't want to leave us on too much of a cliffhanger. So just for review and or just context of where we're headed here. So the book of Esther is happening in that period after the exile of the nation of Israel into Babylon, and then Babylon got conquered by the Medo-Persian Empire, and now we're looking at an event happening with that Persian king a few generations after the conquering of Babylon. And so we saw in chapter 1 the disposition, if you will, of Vashti, the original king of King Ahasuerus. And then chapter 2, we saw that there was a selection process, and Esther was selected to be queen a few years after Vashti left her position. And then we saw that Mordecai, who's Esther's cousin, sometimes referred to as uncle because of an older generational gap between the two of them, who raised her as a kind of father figure for most of her life after her parents died. We saw that he refused to stand and honor what most commentators call the prime minister, the second in charge of the Persian Empire, whose name is Haman. And so Mordecai refused to bow down or to in any way show reverence or honor to Haman as he walked through the city gates. And so that infuriated Haman, and he convinces the king to issue a decree that every single Jewish person within the empire, which we don't think there would be any Jewish people outside of the empire, should be destroyed and killed and annihilated. He wants everything taken from them, or wants their life taken from them, and then they're going to plunder their goods, and he then even promises that he'll pay about 150, whatever that was, $1 million of silver into the king's treasury. And that left Mordecai and then eventually Esther, when she found out about it as well, in a situation where they were in deep mourning and deeply, deeply, rightfully concerned that their entire nation, everything they've ever stood for, all of the promises made to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all of that might go away if something doesn't happen. And of course, we've been mentioning all the way through by observation that God's name and the mention of prayer and anything associated with trusting in the Lord during this process seems to be completely stripped away and removed from the text. It would be so easy to have included it, but it seems, by my estimation, and we'll take a look at that at the final week, next week, that the Holy Spirit had a purpose in keeping his name or God's name outside of the Bible for the book of Esther, the whole book of Esther. All right, so last week it kind of ended with Esther hearing and agreeing with her uncle or her cousin Mordecai that she would in fact go in and make a petition, a request for the king to make him aware that he's just signed a decree, or a decree has been signed in his name by Haman, that her people, who he doesn't know she's Jewish, will be destroyed about 11 months from this time period. Like they cast lots, they rolled the pur dice or whatever it was, and they cast these lots and found out that in the 12th month, and they were in the first month, the 12th month that the nation of Israel would be scheduled for their destruction and annihilation. So she agreed. She said, I will go in to see the king, but recognize or just understand he's not summoned me for 30 straight days, and if I go in unwelcomed or uninvited, then the law of the Persians is I'll die unless he extends the golden scepter to me as a sign of king's mercy, and if he does, then I get to live. So she says that she and all of her eunuchs and the other women in her household that she lives in as queen will fast for 3 straight days. Presumably pray, but again, praying is left out of that. And then she also asked Mordecai, you and all the Jews with you, wherever they are, please also fast with me for 3 days, and then I will go in and see the king. So that's kind of where the summary of the whole book up to this point and where we left off from last week. So in chapter 5, wherever you want to see the scriptures on your own, for your own devices or Bibles or on the screen, we're going to read the first 8 verses here of chapter 5 and see that how exactly Esther handles her responsibilities to go in and try and save her entire nation from extermination, genocide. So, Esther chapter 5, verse 1. Now it happened on the 3rd day, so this is the 3rd day of the fasting that she's been doing. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house. So it was when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court that she found favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? And it shall be given to you up to half the kingdom." So Esther answered, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet that I have prepared for him." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther has said." So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. At the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom. It shall be done." Then Esther answered and said, "My petition and request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." Okay, so that's her response, her initial response to the situation. Let's take a look at this in a little more detail. So we recognize again on the 3rd day after the fasting, she's been fasting for 3 days, or on the 3rd day of the fast, she has gone in and agreed to go see the king uninvited. So she puts on her royal robe, presumably or possibly her crown, indicating her position in the empire that the king himself has appointed her to. And then she proceeded to go in and stand in the inner court of the king's palace uninvited, as far as she was really permitted to go at that point. She goes in uninvited, stands in that gateway or that doorway, so the king might be able to see her. As we talked about last week, so the law required that everyone be put to death who came uninvited. And this was to protect the king and protect the king's schedule, all of those kind of things where, if you don't come in, if you're not invited, you don't have any business with the king, is the general law. And as we've been talking about all the way through the book, it's been mentioned that the laws of the Medes and the Persians cannot be changed. So King Ahasuerus may or may not have been the one who implemented this law, but even if he was the one that did implement it, once it's implemented, once he's put his signet ring on the order, it can't be changed. You can modify some things in some ways, but you can't actually change the laws, and that's just the way the Medes and the Persians operate. So the only way to avoid death, because this is the law, the only way to death is the law did have this clause that allowed the king to extend the golden scepter and show grace and favor to the person who's breaking the law. I mean, they're deemed a lawbreaker by going in, but he can say, well, even though you've broken the law, I will grant you the one way that allows you relief from the penalty of breaking that law, which is death. Okay. So, by fortunate happenstance, we might say, the king was sitting on his royal throne and in the royal house, and he was facing the entrance where he could see who entered. I think that's significant, because if he was on a little break, having lunch or taking care of some other business or whatever, and he couldn't see her, those that stand at the gate may have said, sorry, Queen Esther, you have not been invited. You can't see the king, and there's but one law for you. So he happens to be on his throne, and he happens to be looking towards the gate. So these were perfect conditions for the king to actually take notice of Esther. So he's sitting where he belongs, and she is found, visible to him as he looks on. So, like I said, if the king was temporarily off his throne, the palace guards may have executed Esther, because that's what the law required. And they were supposed to be the gatekeepers and the enforcers of the law. So even if it wouldn't have been the king's, express will, the law required that she be put to death. But she's standing there, and she's waiting to see if she can receive grace. So, and if the king had not been facing the door, which was as far as Esther could actually go into the palace to see her husband, the king, then the guards may have executed Esther, again in obedience to the law. So when the king saw Esther standing in the court, it says that she immediately found favor in his sight. And that just erases all those questions or doubts. Now, we don't know what he's been doing for 30 days. We seriously doubt whether he's has fidelity in his marriage and all of that, but he still has love and care and honor for the woman that he has appointed as queen, and that means something in the story. So the king held out the golden scepter that was in his hand, indicating that he is in fact accepting and willing to override the Persian law, which required his wife to be put to death for her transgression. So based on him extending the scepter to her, Esther then was able to draw near to the king, come in from that outer gate, and then she touches the top of the scepter, indicating that she's receiving what he's offering by way of grace, right? So he has to extend it, she has to receive it, and so she touches that and says, thank you for saving my life, and then they can conduct whatever business that they both want to do from that point. Okay, number 5, the king then asked Esther to make a request. So he knows, it doesn't require any special intuition here. He knows that if she's come in and he had to extend the golden scepter to save her life, she's got something on her mind. She wants to talk to him about something, and presumably it's not maybe the typical husband and wife kind of things. It's more she's got something important to ask, and he's going to extend her the greatest favor he can in terms of telling her that she still has found favor in his sight. So he understood for her to come in uninvited and to risk her life, that she's clearly got something of very special or specific to request of him. The king offered the customary ancient declaration. You see this all the way up into the New Testament era with Herod and Herod's daughter-in-law that he's sleeping with or whatever. This kind of extended this typical royal decree or statement that a king might make from the throne. He says, but it's only extended to someone who's found abundant favor with the king. He's not going to say this just anybody who walks through the door. This is somebody who he truly trusts or loves or respects enough to make it. It says, your request will be granted up to half the kingdom. Now, we don't know what that means, and I don't think he's actually saying, you take that territory and I'll take this territory, or you take that part of the royal treasury and I'll take that part. He's simply saying, I will give you any reasonable request that you're making of me. I have the power. If you make a reasonable request, you will certainly find favor with me. That's what he's really trying to communicate to her through the words he's speaking. So yes, any reasonable request will be granted. However, to keep the tension and the story progressing along here in some ways, but also you'll see for very specific reasons, Esther refrains from making her request to the king that Mordecai had asked her or prompted her to go and make. So if you recall from last week or last chapter, Mordecai says, you've got to go. Our entire people, our nation, all who have descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are in deep trouble and will be killed and exterminated if you don't take the opportunity and go in to see the king. But by divine providence and perhaps her own wisdom and prudence over the situation, Esther holds off on making this primary request that her cousin Mordecai had told her to go in and make, which is obviously save the people, She's saving, but she saves that request for a more opportune time, and probably is being led by the Holy Spirit or holy angels who are helping her to navigate this situation. It just doesn't say that. It doesn't say what she's thinking, but we see as the story unfolds, there's a clear reason why there's a delay in the request. Okay. So possibly, just some speculation here, but the public setting of such an important request, one which actually directly challenged the king's authority and his leadership decisions, may not have resulted in a favorable outcome. Okay, so she comes in. He's got all of his court officers and wise men and magicians or whatever standing around him, and she comes in and says, you know that order you signed about 3 or 4 days ago? I have a real problem with that. Is that going to go over well? Right? It's really public. It could be embarrassing for the queen to question the decision-making of her husband, the king. And so it may just simply be a public declaration of my desires or my request is not going to go as well as if I can find a different way to make the request of him and talk to him as a man, not as king sitting on the throne kind of thing. Okay. So, letter C here. Since the king and Esther had not been together, as we know, for a minimum of 33 days now, she may have felt his heart may not have been in the proper place to grant her this, politically sensitive request, right? So she doesn't know where he's at. She's been out for 30 days. She recognizes that he has far more power in the relationship than she does in that situation at the moment. So she may not be comfortable because she just doesn't know, even though he's extended the scepter and he's even made this statement about up to half my kingdom, she may be like, well, but how come he hasn't really desired to call me back for the last month? So she's, feeling things out, the situation out a little bit is another possibility. Or letter D, instead of making a request to save her people, she simply invites the king and Haman to a banquet that she has prepared for them. So I presume that in part of her preparation here, she told, I assume, whether she's a great cook or not a great cook, I assume that she had all of those servants that worked for the queen over in the queen's house already having a fully prepared banquet ready for the three of them, king, queen, and Haman, to go into this banquet that she says she's prepared for them. So maybe she came at the right lunchtime or whatever it may be, maybe dinner. And consistent with the book of Esther, itself, this modest request to dine with the king serves to build anticipation and curiosity over what was really on Esther's mind to the king, right? She's building a little bit of tension. She's building, I think she probably knows. The king just wants, wants to know, well, tell me what you want. It's like if, your kid calls you up or your boss calls you up and says, I'd like to have a meeting with you tomorrow. Okay, that could go really well, or that could maybe not go as well as I hope. And, it builds some level of tension or, anxiety or desire to know what's really going to happen. And so I think that plays into it as well. It's part of this great story. We talked about how great the book of Esther is in terms of a literary storytelling device, although it's entirely historical and true. It really is building tension all the way through. Of course, we're splitting it up over a number of weeks, but as you read it, and if you've never read that book before, as you read it, you're thinking, okay, what's going to happen next? Why did she wait? I can't wait to see what the outcome is. She's found favor in sight. Why not just go for it and say what you want? But again, that's not entirely in the Lord's plans, and it wasn't in Esther's plans to take that opportunity at that time. Letter F. Finally, having the king spend more social time away from the official business of the empire may have helped the king to regain a greater fondness for Esther and to have him fully prepared to make a decision in her favor, right? So she can get him off the throne, outside of his royal duties, and just have a nice social engagement with her husband, even though Haman's going to be a part of it. If she can just have some good social time, conversation. I don't know what they did back then. I don't know how kings and queens interacted with one another, but it may be that it's just she's trying to soften the exterior a little bit and get the real man, get to the real man and the heart of the man rather than just the official veneer that's on the outside for the king that he always seems to have to follow. All right, number 7. The king does not delay in accepting Esther's request and orders that Haman be brought to the palace so that both of them could attend her banquet. So the king again prompts Esther to tell him, okay, what's the real request? I know you want to, okay, I appreciate the banquet and all that, but what's your real request? I will give you whatever you desire up to half the kingdom, or I will fulfill any reasonable request. Okay, but I think he knows that she must have something really big to ask, given that she's gone through this whole process. I'm gonna call a banquet. I'm gonna have you come over. I won't tell you until you get to the banquet. And then when he gets to the banquet, he asks again, and she says, well, really what I want you to do is come to another banquet tomorrow. Okay. So the king again assured Esther, obviously, that all reasonable requests will be fulfilled. And then I just want you to notice her humility, her deference to her husband and his position, and is not trying to exert any type of undue influence or authority over him through these requests. I think she humbly and respectfully requests that if she's found favor in his sight, before she asks this big thing, okay, that both the king and Haman will attend the second banquet that she has planned for the next day. And if the king agreed to come to that second banquet, she's promising him now, I will let you know what the real reason why I've asked you to, why I've come before you uninvited, and why I've invited you to 2 subsequent banquets, right? So she's promising him that's the last time. Just come again to another banquet tomorrow, and I will tell you what I really have in mind. Okay. So in addition to being what I consider to be a strong bargaining strategy for Esther here, and obviously, or possibly you might say, consistent with the cultural practices of the day, Middle East negotiation, this is not ethnic, any kind of statements, Middle East negotiation just requires that people kind of go through a process that most of us on our Western culture side of things just don't get. I remember having, just as a complete side note, I went to a conference with somebody who was doing some speaking, and he lived in the Middle East. He was an American, no cultural reference there. Went to the Middle East. I don't know if any of you had those kind of experiences or yourself personally, but went to the Middle East, and he started realizing everybody wants me to negotiate. You pull into a gas station, and it says, $2.50 for gas on the pump. They don't expect you to pay $2.50 on the pump, and they actually get insulted if you just pay them the $2.50 a gallon. They want you to go in and say, will you take $1.75? And they'll say, no, $2.25. And they want the negotiation. They want you to have skin in the game in the process. And he said, everything is like that. Menu prices, gas prices, hotel prices, doesn't matter what you do. At least it was back probably 20 years ago when this guy was giving me the instructions on this. It's just expected. You never pay the advertised price, and if you do, it's insulting to them that you wouldn't negotiate with them. Okay, so I put that in there as kind of that context. She's kind of working through this historical negotiation process with him and say, well, why don't you come to a banquet and I'll tell you then what my request is, and maybe we can come to an agreement on that. It's part of the culture that they were in. And certainly no pejorative statements from me about that. It's just foreign to us unless we've experienced that kind of culture ourselves. All right, and so Esther is going to reveal the request, and it's clearly, I think we can see, what she's doing here is clearly ordained by God. And if you haven't seen what the next chapter holds, you certainly will begin to understand that as it comes, or the next section of it. Okay, though, of course, no mention of God is here. But it's clear that her delay has a providence and a purpose from heaven that's being orchestrated here. But again, it's consistent. There is no mention of God in her 2 requests to have him come to a banquet and the delay in actually making this vital and important request to save her nation's life. Okay, so the last section of chapter 5 here is, we once again, just to remind us, we see Haman's wrath again grow against Mordecai. along with his own pride and pain over not receiving what the respect and honor that he thinks that he's due. So verses 9 through 14 of chapter 5, we'll read that. So Haman went out that day joyful and glad with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. And he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, and everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above all of the officials and servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come with the king to a banquet that she has prepared. And tomorrow I am again invited by her, along with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing, for so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows be made 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it, and then go merrily with the king to the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. So he's preparing for this. Okay. So just looking at this short section here, Haman obviously leaves this banquet. He's wow, I'm the only other person who's not pure royalty in the whole empire, and I've been invited to this banquet with the king and the queen. He's so happy. He's so joyful. Okay, so the king and Esther clearly, I would put this in sarcastic quotes here. They clearly understood his honored position with the empire. They recognize he's an important fellow, and he should always be honored along with them. And so he alone was asked to join the king and the queen for their special meal. And, perhaps the queen even needed his assistance in whatever she was planning for the king. Maybe it's really important, he feels, that he be involved in whatever she's going to ask the king about, because it involves him helping her get what she's asking for in some way. Who knows what he's ultimately thinking, but he thinks he's really important and really special and obviously prideful and arrogant. And surely no other servant of the king had ever received such a great honor as Haman has received. I mean, he's just filled with this, pride and arrogance over what has been happening to him just in the last few hours. Okay. But when Haman saw Mordecai standing in the gate, Mordecai again refused to stand or to tremble before Haman. And you can just imagine, he goes from that manic depressive. He's super, super, super thrilled with how the events of the day have gone. He walks out and he sees his arch enemy for whatever reason he's chosen, and he's like getting no respect. So the king and the queen are giving him what he thinks to be his great honor, great respect, great responsibility. He's got wealth and power and privilege in every capacity. And here's this Jew who won't pay him the least bit of respect. So Mordecai's refusal to honor Haman filled him with indignation. Having to wait 11 months to see your arch enemy is a really long time to wait, especially when you're a prideful narcissist, right? So let's take a look at this word indignation here. So in the Hebrew, it's hama, and it means heat, rage, poison, venom, spittle, fury. And it's connected to the whirlwind that God uses to describe his anger in Jeremiah 23 and 19. So, just before I get to there, notice it's like he's spitting angry. He's so mad. He's furious that this man Haman will not respect him. And he's, obviously, for whatever reason, he feels he must hold off and just let the execution order that comes in the 12th month for all the Jews take care of it. But he's really angry. So I thought I'd throw in these couple of verses from Jeremiah. They almost say the same exact thing, but we'll read them both. So Jeremiah 23:19, using that same word, hama. So behold, a whirlwind of the Lord has gone forth in fury, a violent whirlwind. It will fall violently on the head of the wicked. Like God is demonstrating, I'm coming in a whirlwind, and I'm going to judge, and I'm going to fall on the head of the wicked. So it's the same kind of fury that God has against sin and wicked people is the kind of fury that Haman is kind of trying to express here against Mordecai. And then in chapter 30, verse 23, almost the same thing, but behold, the whirlwind of the Lord goes forth with fury, a continuing whirlwind. It will fall violently on the head of the wicked. It's the same kind of, that's the kind of fury that is expressed in the story that Haman has for Mordecai. All right. Well, nevertheless, despite Haman's intense rage at Mordecai, he restrains himself from taking immediate action, and he just goes home instead. And he's going to call his friends and tell them about how painful it is that Mordecai is still alive. Okay. So, number 3, once he returned home, Haman called for his wife and friends to come and comfort him. Of course, he starts off with boasting about how great his riches are. He's clearly rich, and he's bragging to his companions about how rich he is. He boasts about all of his abundant children, and to his companions, he boasts about how he's been promoted in the kingdom, in the empire, above all other servants, all other royalty or officials in the kingdom. He's at the highest level he could possibly have obtained. Okay. And he boasted about how he'd been invited to this special banquet of Queen Esther. It's super special banquet. But then he tells you, exactly as you would expect, that regardless of all the success, all the wealth, all the power that has been granted to me, I am really, really a special person in the entire empire. It's meaningless. It's meaningless as long as Mordecai continues to stand in the gate of the city, right? So you could multiply my wealth, you could multiply my power, you can multiply everything, and if that man Mordecai will not honor me, it's nothing to me. He's so hyper-focused on one person, he can't even see what else is going on around him. And it's, an obsession for him. It's become this obsession, and we, as humans, don't often do well with those types of obsessions. So he's obsessed, and he wants relief. He wants satisfaction for his anger. So, this is an example to us to recognize that focusing on these trivial aspects of life while ignoring substantial blessings that we may have received will lead us to a level of despair, especially when we allow pride and arrogance to fill our hearts. I mean, here he is, not all that unlike Solomon in the song, or not Song of Solomon, but in Ecclesiastes, where Solomon said, I've tried everything, every single pleasure, every single satisfaction thing I could possibly bring to myself. It's like vapor, it's like the wind, it means nothing to me, nothing. All of the wives and concubines and all of the money and all the accolades and glory and having been called the wisest man who's ever lived. It's like, what else? I'm still striving for something. I can't find it. And here's Haman, pretty much in the same boat here, saying, I've achieved everything there is to achieve in this empire, and I can only focus on one thing, my hatred for Mordecai. All right, letter G. So then Haman's wife and friends try to help him out, and they make a suggestion of how Haman should deal with his rage at this time. He should order that a gallows of 50 cubits high, which is about 75 feet minimum. Well, cubits range from about 16 inches to 22 or 24 inches, so it could be closer to 100 feet, really, but it's no small gallows, right? And we talked about a week or two ago, gallows does not necessarily mean the same thing that we think of in modern gallows and lopping off people's heads and all of that. It's really, most commentators are agreeing it's like an impaling stick. Stick a dead person on top of the stick. We'll talk about that a little bit further in the evening here, but it was the method of execution for the Persians, especially when they wanted it to be a very public execution and for the whole world around them to take notice. Oh, I don't want that to happen to me. Okay. All right. So they tell him, build this gallows 50 cubits high, and then go to the king first thing in the morning and request to have Mordecai executed. Then you'll be fine. All your troubles will go away. If you can just go tell the king, there's one thing that's making me so unhappy. Will you grant me to kill Mordecai on the gallows? It's already prepared in my front yard. We'll just go hang him on it, and then, everything will be great from there. Okay. So, with such great height, And with all the city knowing how Mordecai had not shown proper honor to Haman, his execution would be widely seen and thereby serve as a warning to all others who might think about not honoring Haman as they should. And here's the note in here I was just making a reference to. This may be the beginnings of the process of developing crucifixion as a means of execution. The Persians did invent it, but it was really perfected by the Romans. But several hundred years after these events is when it's changed from like an impaling stick to a cross and somebody being actually nailed to the cross and all of the events that happen there. So while the impaling stick would probably be relatively quick, in whatever way you impale the person on the stick, they're probably going to die relatively soon, within minutes or an hour, or who knows what. The cross was intended to let someone suffer for hours or days or even weeks. But the intention was that when someone walked into the city and they saw somebody out there dying on the cross, suffering excruciating pain, that they would say, well, I don't know what that guy did, but I sure don't want to do it and get hung on his cross either, right? That's the kind of intention. That's why this thing is 50 cubits high, to warn the world, don't mess with Haman. Okay, that's kind of the suggestion that his family and friends are making for him. Okay, then once Mordecai was executed, Haman could go merrily. I love it. Go merrily. Your arch enemy's dead, so go merrily off to this second banquet that you're going to go to tomorrow. So the thing that was spoken pleased Haman, and he accepted the advice, and he had this gallows built and prepared. I don't know how long it takes to build a 50-foot gallows, but I'm sure he had plenty of workers available to him. He's rich and he's powerful, so they built the gallows, and it was ready to go for the next morning. Okay, so that's Haman's day, the same day as that first banquet. All right, but as I've been mentioning here, if you haven't seen or haven't read ahead in the story or don't remember, all this is just God's providence set up to really unfold the story in a miraculous way before us here. And so we're going to talk in the first 3 verses of chapter 6 about King Ahasuerus' sleepless night. Okay, so this is the night between the banquets. She's had a banquet. She's promised to tell him what her request is the next day. Haman's planning to request to have Mordecai killed the next day. And here's what happens on the sleepless night of of King Ahasuerus. Okay, so that night the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told Bigthana and Teresh, the 2 of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" And the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." Okay? Sleepless night, calls in for the records. They happen to read the story of Mordecai 4 or 5 years earlier. And then the king says, well, we should honor somebody who saved my life, but nothing has been done for him. So the king was unable to sleep between this banquet night. Okay, so I just throwing out some possibilities for consideration. Possibly he was considering what Esther could have wanted to make this request of him. Can you imagine the king? He's going, what would Esther really want? She's got a big house. She's got plenty of servants. She's got all the treasuries available to her. What could she want? Can you imagine thinking, I can't wait to find out what it is? It's like my son, it used to be, not anymore, but used to be on Christmas Eve, waiting for Christmas morning. What's in those boxes? What's in those boxes? I want to know, right? And so king wants to know what's in her request. What does she have? So he's perhaps he's contemplating. Can you imagine? I can see myself doing this, pondering what she might ask, and would I say yes to that, or what would I say no to? What could she possibly ask that I might have to say no to? And so can you imagine he's categorizing? Maybe he's thinking and categorizing. Well, I would certainly say yes to this. Would I say no to that for my queen? I mean, he's up all night. He's having trouble sleeping. Okay, so her little negotiating tactic or her double banquet scheme or plan here that she has, and I don't want to call it in a bad way, but this plan that she has may have contributed to his sleeplessness that night. Okay, possibly. Okay. What should be clear is that the king's sleepless night and Esther's 2 banquets is all by divine providence. It's clear that Esther has this plan by divine ordinance or providence to have a double banquet 2 days in a row, and the king will have a night in between these 2 banquets. Okay, God is at work. He's just not spoken of or mentioned. So, though, to deal with his insomnia, the king requested to have the book of the records of the Chronicles, a Persian history book, brought in to have a servant read to any section to him. He's trying to read me something boring so I can fall asleep, right? Read me some of the events of the Chronicles of Kings. I'll start, hopefully I'll doze off because I don't really want to listen to that anyway. So while the accounts are being read, the record of Mordecai's noble act of saving the king's life was recalled for the king to hear again. And you can just imagine, I'm sure the records were big, and he probably just said, turn to whatever page and just start reading. I'm trying to get to sleep here. But by divine providence, they happened to read about Mordecai. So specifically, it was recounted when they were reading to him, and he was still awake and able to process information, how Mordecai warned the king through Esther that the plot had been devised to kill him. However, in the rereading of this account, it became clear that a breach of protocol had occurred here. Mordecai had never been rewarded or honored for his actions in saving the king. I don't know if Mordecai wanted to be honored or recognized. Doesn't matter. They had a protocol where that should have happened, and it didn't. And if we think that it was an accident that it didn't happen 5 years earlier, and it had to wait until this night to be discovered, and all this is going to happen, we're not really seeing what the Lord is doing in the story here for us. There's just simply no accidents or coincidences in any of this that's happening. So, see, the fact that Mordecai had not been honored became a pressing concern for the king, who clearly wanted to rectify that situation immediately. It's like, as soon as we have an opportunity tomorrow morning, we are going to go and honor Mordecai. So that's the mindset of the king. The king's mindset is, Mordecai saved my life. Mordecai hasn't been honored. The breach is on us. We should have done this for him. He really needs to know that we honor and respect him. I mean, if a man isn't honored for saving the king's life, when do you give him honor? Right? The king almost certainly would have been killed had Mordecai not stepped in to save him. All right. So then we're going to see that Mordecai is now going to be honored by the king and by Haman. Okay? Watch what happens here. You can just see all the irony and all of, maybe even God having a little bit of a laugh here in heaven about what Haman thinks is going to happen this day and what actually turns out to be. So, in verse 4 of chapter 6 of Esther, so the king said, "Who is in the court?" And so now Haman had just entered the outer court. So you almost get the impression here that the king is still kind of, trying to get to sleep. But it's now break of day, and Haman comes in super early in the morning because he wants to be the first in line to have a conversation with the king and ask him to allow him to kill Mordecai. Okay. So now Haman had just entered the court of the king's palace to suggest to the king that to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's servant said to him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in. I mean, he's kind of my right-hand guy. I've got a really special thing for him to do for me this morning." So Haman came in, and the king asked him, "What shall be done for the man to whom the king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought in his heart, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" Ooh, I know what I'm going to say here now. And Haman answered the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, and has a royal crest placed on his head. Let this robe and this horse and be delivered to the hand of the one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square and proclaim before him, 'Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" Then the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robe and the horse, as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits within the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken." lump in the throat, swallow hard. So Haman took the robe and the horse and arrayed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city square and proclaimed before him, "Thus it shall be done to the man to whom the king delights to honor." Afterward, Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. And when Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said, "Well, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him." And while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. All right. Well, I think most of this is pretty obvious, but let's walk through what we see here. All right. Haman rushed in to meet with the king, presumably, as I said, first thing in the morning, to request permission to execute Mordecai for his disloyalty. He's already got a death warrant signed against him. In about 11 months, he's going to die with all the other Jews, but he's coming in haste to make this request to the king. And the king let Haman in. He's number 2 in the empire. He's kind of the prime minister or whatever you might call him. He's kind of number 2, and so he's there at the king's hand, or comes to the king's gate, and he's ready to make this formal request to actually have royal permission to kill one man in the empire. And the king inquired. So, I mean, I think it's protocol. The king gets to speak first, right? Haman doesn't get to come in and say, "Hey, before you ask me what you have for me, I've got something really important I want to tell you." No, I think Haman has to wait for his turn and say, "Okay, so king, if you have something for me, let's do that. And then I've got this one request I want to make of you." But he doesn't get that far. So the king inquired of Haman as to what Haman would recommend to be done for a man whom the king is now desiring to greatly honor. And immediately, of course, we see in the text here, Haman assumes he's got to be speaking about Haman because he wants to honor Haman. I mean, who else could possibly be more deserving of honor than himself? He's filled with pride and arrogance, and right. If king's going to let me honor, set my own way of being honored. Well, here, let me shoot for the fences here, right? And so Haman's response is straight out of his prideful heart to fulfill what he desires most, to be further exalted even more so than he ever has been yet in the kingdom. And so he says, "Let a royal robe be brought out, which the king has worn." Basically saying, I want to usurp the place of the king himself. I think it would be a massive breach of royal protocol for any man who's not of royalty to wear the king's robe. But he's saying, look, I want it. I want the empire to think of me as king instead of you, Ahasuerus, right? Oh, you can still play king, but I want the empire and the city around us to think Haman's really in charge. Haman's really the king. So I want to take one of your robes that you have actually worn and people recognize as yours, and I'll put it on, and they'll think, well, if he's wearing the king's robe, he must be super special, right? That's the process, the wheels spinning in his brain that he wants to be honored. And he goes even further. "Let a horse be brought on whom the king has ridden upon. All the townsfolk will know that's the king's horse. I've seen the king riding that horse. Haman's riding it. He must be super special." This is, again, his pride and arrogance coming out, what he wants for himself. And he's really trying to usurp the actual position of the king by putting himself in the king's place. "And let a royal crest be placed on a horse's head." Again, usurping it, this royal crest. So here the man is wearing royal robes, he's riding the king's horse, and a crest of the king is on the horse's head. So everyone will think, well, maybe Haman's actually king now. Maybe Haman isn't even king anymore, right? He's trying to put himself in the place of the highest person in the kingdom. And he says, let most noble princes of the king, those who should be surrounding the king, robe the horse and the man who desires to honor him. So don't just let eunuchs go out and do this for the man. Let the princes of the king come out and actually begin to honor this man as if he were king. Okay? And then let the honoree be given a one-man parade through the whole city square, and have a herald walking before him, saying, thus it shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor. Right? He just, keep proclaiming it. Watch. You see who's riding the horse? This is excellency. This is royalty. Honor him. Trust him. Respect him. Okay. Now, this seems like a good place to take a diversion and say, let's talk about what Scripture actually says about pride. Because you're not seeing pride in what Haman's doing here, you're missing really the whole point. So, just a few proverbs and the various things in here. So, when pride comes, then comes shame, but with the humble is wisdom. Proverbs 11:12. The wicked in his pride persecutes the poor. Let them be caught in the plots in which they have devised. Oh, Psalm 10, verse 2. In Proverbs 14:3, in the mouth of a fool is the rod of pride, but the lips of the wise preserve him. And of course, most of you probably recognize this one. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. You see what's coming for Haman, right? And then a man's pride will bring him low, but the humble in spirit will retain honor. A man's pride will bring him low, but humble in spirit will retain honor. Proverbs 29:23. And then a couple of verses here out of Obadiah, a one-chapter book in the Old Testament, verses 3 and 4. The pride of your heart has deceived you. You who dwell in the clefts of the rock, whose habitation is high. You who say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? I'm pride. I am so good. And then verse 4. Though you ascend as high as the eagle, and as though you set your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, says the Lord. That's what the Scripture says about people who are filled with pride. I think you see Haman filled with pride, and based on that, you're going to see how God fulfills what he has prophetically spoken of those who retain such pride. Number 4 in our notes. So the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robe and the horse which you've suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew who sits in the king's gate. Now, honestly, just guessing. Now, King Ahasuerus, he's kind of that wishy-washy. You kind of don't dislike him, and you kind of don't like him all that much in this whole story here. He's not great. He's not bad. I don't think if that breach of protocol of him failing to honor Mordecai for saving his life, and he hadn't honored him 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, whatever the time frame was back there, I don't think he would have said, oh, it's okay, yeah, let's go put the king's robe on him and have him ride the king's horse. I think that may have been a little over the top. But Ahasuerus is saying, we failed to honor this man. We've got to show him we respect and honor the fact that the king would have died had he not come forward and spoken up. So I think all of Haman's prideful suggestions didn't even faze King Ahasuerus, because he was like, I cannot believe that Mordecai hasn't been honored. What must he be thinking of us? Let's go honor the man, just as you have said, right? I think that's what's going through the king's mind. I'm only speculating. You can't hold me to that or the Scripture to that, because I'm just reading into what I think I see here. But I think Haman's over-the-top suggestions would have been flatly rejected had it not been that breach of protocol that had occurred, and the king is trying to make amends for something that should never have happened in the first place. All right. Huh?
He was kind of, what I took out of it was, he was kind of like the dimmest light bulb.
Yeah.
Compared to all
He's
the other kings in the Bible, he was
right.
kind of like,
He gets pulled in a lot of different directions by different people. The only thing he seems to be super upset by is Vashti not parading herself before him, and that's the only thing he seems to really take a big stand on.
but that wasn't even his idea.
No, her punishment wasn't even his idea. He needed advisors to tell him what we should do, right? Yeah, he's certainly not the protagonist of the story. Esther and Mordecai are certainly the ones that we're supposed to focus on in terms of living rightly for God, even though he's not mentioned. Okay. So, can you imagine Haman's shock and being dismayed at what the king had just spoken to him? What? Who? What? I mean, I could. How did he keep a straight face before the king? I'm sure he tried, but how did he keep a straight face after thinking, I'm going to get the king's royal robe. I'm going to get to ride the king's royal horse. I'm going to be honored. The whole town or city or nation is going to think I'm fantastic. And then my enemy, the man I came a second ago to ask you to kill for me, you want to honor him? I mean, I don't even know if he asked why. Why do you want to do this for Mordecai? I can just imagine he's shocked and dismayed, has no idea what's going on and how his life got so miserable so fast. Letter B, the king knew specifically who Mordecai was. I think this is impressive, okay? That even though, as the account was read overnight, he knows not just that a man named Mordecai sent message to me to save my life about these eunuchs that were trying to kill me, but he says, go. Mordecai's that Jew. He knows his nationality, okay? And the king doesn't seem to have put together, I just signed a decree to kill all Jews in the kingdom, and a Jew saved my life, and I want to go honor him today. I'm not sure he's making that connection just yet, okay? But he knows him, and he says, he's Mordecai. You know him. He sits in the king's gate. Haman, go find him. He sits in the king's gate. You'll know where he is. I'm sure Haman knew exactly where he was. All right. Perhaps the king himself also knew of Mordecai's public and loud mourning in sackcloth and ashes. The king might have actually, possibly, I don't know, but he knows Mordecai well enough to know he sits in the king's gate, and Mordecai is getting as close to the palace as he possibly could, and he's wailing in sackcloth and ashes when he reads this order to destroy all of his people. Okay, so king may have known who he was from that, but I don't know. It's possible. Again, all we can do is speculate from what's not recorded in the text. But knowing that Mordecai was a Jew and that he personally saved the king's life will obviously greatly contribute to the events that still are yet to come in the story. So number 5, under that section, Haman was commanded to personally go, you do this now. Okay, you personally take the king's robe and the king's horse and do all to exalt and honor Mordecai just as Haman wanted to be done for himself. It wasn't just Haman could go and order his next, his right-hand man, we got to go honor Mordecai. I'm going to stay back and you go take care of this. The king said, I want you, Haman, go honor Mordecai exactly as you just proposed that I should honor him with. Okay, so the fact that Mordecai is being honored, the way that Haman envisioned himself being honored, must have been an extra measure of humiliation for him. I mean, not just like somebody else besides me is getting an honor, but Mordecai has been, he knows, whether the king knows or not, Haman knows that the whole city knows that Mordecai continuously refuses to honor him. He knows it. They've been telling him. They were the ones, remember, they were the ones that told him, hey, Mordecai refuses to stand. He refuses to bow down and honor you. He refuses to do anything to honor you. Haman knows that the whole city is going to go, why is Haman putting a royal robe on Mordecai and leading him through the city when it was Mordecai who refused to honor him? They're probably, he's going, what are they going to think of me? Can I just shrink down and let nobody see that I'm doing this? The humiliation, I don't know if I can begin to express the level of humiliation this man must have felt, especially given the great height of his pride. Number 7, after the parade was completed, Mordecai went back to the same duties at the king's gate as he had been doing. The honoring that the king did for Mordecai didn't seem to change his mood or his character at all. Okay, he was honored in such a way, but nothing changed for him. He went right back to whatever he had been previously doing. I had this little parade through the city. Okay, fine. I'm going to go back and do what I used to do. Haman, on the other hand, hurries back to his own house, the one with the gallows that he'd prepared for Mordecai, looming 75 feet in the air. And he goes home with his head covered in extreme shame over what he had just had to experience on this day. And his wife and friends are at home waiting they're at home. They're waiting for him to be able to bring Mordecai in. They're going to execute him that very morning for him. They're just waiting for the great events to take place. Okay, his great moral victory that he's going to have over his arch enemy Mordecai. And here he comes without Mordecai, with his head covered in shame, and he has to communicate to them what went wrong in the last few hours. However, when they learn of the events that Mordecai was a Jew, they quickly change their outlook and advice to Haman. Okay? Perhaps Haman should have disclosed Mordecai's Jewish heritage before they devised this plan to kill him. It's like they went, oh, wait a minute. Oh, wait a minute. You mean Mordecai's a Jew? If you have something planned against a Jew, it will certainly result in your fall and his, restoration or his exaltation or something. Like, maybe you should have told him he was a Jew in the first place. But obviously in the story, again, it would be like, why did they think that? Because somehow they think that the Jews have the Lord's favor, but they don't say it. And nobody says it in the story that God won't let Mordecai or the Jewish people suffer in this way. But he never mentioned it to them, and now they were like, oh, well, if he's Jewish, it was really silly of you to think that it would be a good idea to ask the king to execute him in the first place. It was always going to result in your own destruction or your own shame, if nothing else. So that knowing that Mordecai is a Jew, they declare that Haman is marked now. Haman, you're marked for a great fall, having dared to challenge Mordecai, and really I think they're saying and challenge God. They let Haman know that he will surely fall in defeat before Mordecai. Wow. Can you imagine your friends and family? That's like having friends like Job has, right? Oh, you're going to fall this day. Your pride and your arrogance and all that has led you to this point. Again, if only this advice had been given to him the day before. If they'd only said, oh, wait a minute, you don't want to do anything against Mordecai. Just let it be. Things will be better for you. All right, number 9. While the companions of Haman were still talking with him about his pending fall, the king's eunuchs came to bring Haman to Esther's second banquet. So just questions here, how would Haman be able to put the failures of this day already, short day already before him, behind him, and not let the king know he was suffering this great humiliation? He's walking back to his house in shame. He's got his head covered. His family just told him, you're not going to have any success in what you have planned. How's he going to go and have a nice dinner with the king and the queen a few minutes later, right? But they've come to gather him and take him to the banquet that he's been summoned to. But, of course, Haman had no choice but to go, and it seems likely that his heart would have not been as joyful as it was the day before when he had the banquet and he felt all privileged to be invited to that banquet. Okay. So lastly, then we'll take our break. As it has been throughout the book, there are so many opportunities in this story for the author who's writing this account for us, or the people and the events in the account itself, to have given praise to God or to seek him in prayer. But again, God is not mentioned. Here, despite these seemingly miraculous circumstances that led to Haman, Mordecai, and Esther to each of these situations. Seems like at least a little thank you, Lord, would have been helpful, but it's just not there, and we'll see if we can't make that really shine next week when we actually talk about how we can see God in the book of Esther. But let's take our 5, and we'll come back and we'll work through a fairly short chapter, chapter 7. Thank you for the banana bread in squares. Okay. Very, very good. All right. So, like I said, these are really short chapters, but so we're making good progress there. So we'll probably get out again a little bit early tonight. But chapter 7 in Esther, it's somewhat of a cliffhanger at the end. You know, what's going to happen in this second banquet, and all the kind of intrigue is going to happen. A lot of things will get cleaned up here in chapter 7, but by no means all of the issues, because there's a big one that'll still hang at the end. We'll talk about that because it's a 10-chapter book, so there's more to come. All right, so Esther, chapter 7, verse 1. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. On the second day at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done." Then Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss." So King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, "Who is he and where is he who would dare to presume in his heart to do such a thing?" And Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." So Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. So that's a first section short. She's actually fulfilled what she said she would do. She's told him exactly, plain simple, what's happening here. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther on that next day, the second day. And during the wine portion of the banquet, after they'd eaten their meal, okay, so the king and Haman go, they have the meal, whatever conversation, whatever, whatever other aspects of being able to enjoy that event were there. But now they're just kind of sitting around having some glasses of wine and probably pretty relaxed and all of that. So we can presume that the king and Haman were, just having this relaxing experience. And another wonderful, I'm sure, banquet that Esther prepared, made sure it was perfect in every way for the king and for Haman. And then he says, his curiosity is fully piqued at this point, and he asks Esther, "Reveal your petition. Okay, we've had dinner, we're at this, it's coming to a close. Reveal what you want me to grant to you, please." Okay, so he's asking her, and she promised that she would, so she will. So Esther then reveals to the king all that she and Mordecai desire. Now, Mordecai's not mentioned here, but she's passing along the request that Mordecai has made for her, and what she desires to do for the king, or the king to do for her and for the people. So she begins by stating that if she has found favor, if her life is on the line, the life of her people on the line, but she's deferring to the authority and the royal position of the king. And so she begins, "If I found favor in the king's sight, and if this request will please the king," then she says, "then please take the action that you see fit." Okay, that's really what she's doing. Look at the honor, look at the courtesy, look at the respect for his position. She's his wife, but she's giving him full opportunity here to save face and to come out with a best possible outcome for herself and for her people. So her first request is really to start off with her own life, and also that for her people. Now, I don't think Esther's being selfish here. I think she wants to communicate to the king to know that her life, specifically her life, the queen whom he has previously expressed love for, even proclaimed a holiday in her name for when they first got married, her life is in extreme danger. I'm sure that piqued what's going on in his brain. Why is my queen's life at risk? Why is she in danger? And she also plans to reveal her true identity and her heritage as a Jew. In doing so, remember, we've kept that secret all the way from chapter 2. She has not revealed her true identity. Her real name is Hadassah, and she's been going by Esther, and she has not been revealed to the palace, specifically the king, as being of Jewish descent. So he didn't know any of this until this moment. So then Esther recites those specific terms or threats that have been decreed in the king's name against the nation of Israel, or against the Jews. Okay. So it says they've been sold, as we know, for these 10,000 talents of silver, that $166 million or whatever the amount would have been, or whatever it is. Okay, so you've sold us, an entire people group. You've sold us, and the Jews have not been. It's just, now, you didn't sell us as slaves, okay, and to go and serve another master, but have rather scheduled for them to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. Okay, so she's making again a kind of a logical and a salient point here about what that order and decree has been brought about. So she says, if the king's decree had not required the lives of the entire people of the Jews, Esther says, I would have just held my tongue. I would have been silent, okay, rather than challenging the king's authority. She says, look, if it would have been, if the request, the decree that it come against my people, if it had gone to here, I'd have kept silent, and we would have just accepted whatever had come about. But because the king's decree went all the way to full annihilation of every single living Jew in the empire, I cannot keep silent. Okay, so she's telling him, I'm not bringing some trivial small request. I would have gladly kept silent if it had been any other decree, but I can't keep silent given what has happened. Okay. And then she kind of maybe twists the knife into Haman a little bit as she says this. However, if being slaves was the decree, no amount of money that would have gone into the king's treasury for buying the Jewish people out of your empire would have even compensated you for your loss. You would have, what you think you gained by selling us, you've lost by our productivity within the empire. Okay. We are a good people. We are productive. We are resourceful. We bring far more value than anything you could have ever acquired by selling us as slaves. But you didn't even do that. You sold us to be killed, which is even worse, because now you've got no retribution for your loss. Okay. So upon hearing this, he just hears that maybe she's had a much more longer diatribe, but all we know is that she says, "I'm going to be killed. All my people are going to be killed. This royal decree has been issued, and Haman's the guy who signed it and stamped it with your king, with your royal signet ring." Okay. So the king is outraged upon hearing Esther's words and demands to know who would dare to attempt to do this to his queen and to her people. So he's, again, we're not talking about a completely stable, always thinking the right way kind of king here, but he hears this. He heard Haman make that request. The Jews are against you. They did all this stuff. And he says, yeah, go do whatever you want with them. Just put the money in the treasury. But now he's outraged. Okay. But again, think how Esther has handled this to help him save pride or face or the royal position that he is. She's called him into this private meeting. She said, it's all Haman, not you. And, this is, again, you're going to suffer a great loss if you actually let this continue. So then Esther promptly responds that the man who is presumed to concoct such an evil and wicked scheme is Haman, and he's the adversary of her people. Okay. So again, we'll kind of walk through this. Esther has taken, I think, a very high moral ground, a high loyalty ground in her approach. She is showing herself to be fully loyal to her husband. She's showing herself to be fully loyal to the Persian Empire as she's taken this approach. And she did not challenge the king's authority or his royal appointment as king. She didn't say, what kind of king are you? Why would you sign such a decree? Why would you bring Haman into your position of being the highest in the authority as prime minister or whatever? She's not criticizing him at all. She's taking as much of the heat off of him as she possibly can. Okay. So she doesn't challenge his authority to do it. She doesn't say, what king would do such a thing? Or what king has the authority to do such a thing? She's just said, this has been decreed and it's going to kill us. Okay. So although Haman was a wicked adversary, Esther has clearly treated him with the extreme kindness at these two banquets that she's invited him to. I think that was part of this process. Hey, why don't you bring Haman to a banquet today? And I will be kind to him, I will feed him, I will be nice to him, I will show him all of the great love and kindness that I should, because that's my role, that's my job, okay, as queen and as a hostess, okay? If she had something ill against him, why invite him to the banquet? Or why not start speaking words against him at the first banquet or the second banquet, right? She's called two banquets and showed herself to be honorable in words and deeds against the man who is signed in order to murder millions of her countrymen, or however many there may have been in the empire at the time. Okay. So Esther is not just another beautiful young woman. She was the queen, and she showed her husband, the king, the highest level of honor and respect in her conduct, even when facing her own execution order. Not a thing. What would you charge against Esther in doing wrong in this whole situation? She did everything she could with the highest degree of honor, respect, and courtesy, even to the wicked man Haman in the process, until she was told, who did this thing to you? And she says, it's the wicked Haman who did it. Right? So certainly the king would not be able to find any character flaws or breaches of royal law and the customs of the Persians by her actions. She's guiltless. She's done nothing wrong. And she's here representing her entire people, the Jews. She's here representing them and saying, why would we? What have we done as a people to deserve an execution order, to annihilate our entire population? Right? She's planted all of this through this very shrewd or very well thought out plan of how to get the highest level of favorability in thought and mind of the king, as she then reveals the real reason why she's come and made that request before him. And having been so well treated and honored, it's hard to imagine that the king had any thought other than how he could prevent the death of his beloved wife. Now, think back a couple of days earlier, if she just walked in the throne room and said, you see this order that you have signed, that's your signet ring on it? I'm going to die in 11 months. What are you going to do about it? Right? I mean, whatever approach she could have taken, it could have been off-putting, it could have been disastrous. But she said, I'm going to take the highest possible road and honor this thing. And I promise the king I'll tell him what I need and what I'm requesting, but I'm going to do it at the end of demonstrating how I can show a great level of honor and respect. Yeah, he's her husband, but let's face it, he's really the king. Okay. Well, Haman immediately knows that he's been outmaneuvered by Queen Esther in an instant. Now, he's already had a really bad day. I don't know, whatever that book is, horrible, no good, terribly rotten, really bad day, whatever that book is, I can't quote it. But Haman knows that he's now been outmaneuvered, not just a bad day. Queen Esther has outmaneuvered him intellectually and strategically. She's outmaneuvered him. The king's love for and emotional connection to Esther far exceeded any relationship connection the king had with Haman. Right? She's had this couple of days of rekindling whatever their romance and love and his appreciation for his beauty and for her demeanor and character. And whatever he feels for her is probably now far in excess of whatever he says, well, Haman's a pretty good administrator. She's my queen. She's the one I love. She's the one I called a holiday for. Look how beautiful she is in her royal garments, and what a wonderful banquet she's thrown for me. Haman? Are you kidding me? Choose between those two? No choice at all, right? I think that's probably the kind of the mindset, certainly in Haman, like, how am I going to compete with her in this situation? Number 2, Esther had never shown herself to be someone who used power to manipulate the king or to gain anything from the king more than he desired to grant to her. Haman, well, not so much, right? She didn't ask for extra special favors. Hey, I'm the queen, make sure I get extra, this, that, the other thing. She's never done anything. We never see anything in the story where she's asked for anything. He wants her to be queen? Fine, she'll do the queen thing. She hasn't asked for anything. She's not looking for personal favoritism and reward and power, and she doesn't say, hey, make sure I sit next to you on the throne and I'll help you make all these kingly empire decisions for you. No, when you call me, I'll come. Right? She's never shown any kind of usurping of his authority and his power. Haman, he wants to be in charge. He wants everything that the king has, and he probably is incredibly jealous of what the king does have. Number 3, Esther was respectful of the king in every way and clearly showed herself to be immensely loyal to him, right? There's a death order against me, but if I found favor in your sight, if things are still okay, will you hear my request? Okay, she's not saying, what a fool you've been. You've been tricked and you've been deceived and whatever. She's not criticizing, demeaning. She's just showing him honor. Okay, and so she's respectful of him in every way. So again, Haman's been outmaneuvered here. So while the king had not called for Esther in the 30 days prior to these 2 days, okay, Esther made the clear choice, made the choice clear for her and for Haman, so abundantly clear, I don't know if I've said it that way, made the choice between her and Haman so abundantly clear that even the wicked and narcissistic Haman could clearly see his status with the king had now been shattered, right? She had just done this whole thing in such a way that Haman's looking at it and going, there's no pathway to victory here. There is no pathway where I get out of this with what I want, and probably not with my life. Okay, I think he's immediately seeing that he's scheduled for termination, and he can't find a way out of it. Okay, at least not with his own strategies. So this describes Haman as terrified before the king and queen. I mean, I'm literally shaking, terrified, can't believe what has finally happened to him in the midst of all of this. How did I go from way up here to I don't even know if I'm going to live another 5 minutes, right? How did I go so far so fast? Okay. So Ahasuerus and Esther are shown to be a fully unified couple. He's terrified before them. I think it's important in this line here in chapter 7 that he says he was terrified before the king and the queen. They're together. They're unified. They're king and queen, and they are husband and wife, and he's outside of that relationship. He's in trouble. Okay. And any action against the queen is really an action against the king himself. Wow, I think Haman's seeing that. Okay, taking her out, which I didn't even know she was Jewish, is like taking the king out. And I don't have the power and the authority to have a kingly coup at the moment, so I'm in trouble. Deep, deep trouble. So he's cornered. Haman's cornered. So he's the one who actually wrote that decree that would end the queen's life. And the king was furious that his wife's life was at risk because this one man had hatred for the Jewish people. King's furious about this, right? He may not do everything right. He may not think clearly on everything he does, but he is furious that his wife is now under Persian law ordered to be killed because of her national heritage. Furious. And now, also, I think the fact that Mordecai, this known Jew, whom the king a few hours earlier had gone through this great effort to show the whole town that the king desired to greatly honor this man. I bet you that Mordecai's name filtered through the king's mind at one point and said, I just showed the whole empire that I honored a Jew. We're going to exterminate the Jews? How does that make me look? Doesn't make me look very good, Haman, right? And so I bet in both the king and Haman's mind, they're thinking about Mordecai at some point in time in this exchange. Remember what happened a few hours ago? This does not play well for Haman and how he has been trying to manipulate and overrule the king through the process. All right. And then knowing the king's wrath, Haman was utterly terrified and probably knew, as I've been saying, that he wouldn't make it through this day alive unless he's somehow able to find grace from his sworn enemy, the Jewish Queen Esther, right? All Jews are his enemy. And so now he's got to go and make a pleading before Queen Esther. Maybe. The king won't save me. I think he's certain the king will not have any mercy for him. But maybe this beautiful, gracious, seemingly tender-hearted, loving queen, maybe she'll be able to show me grace and save my life today. Well, as the story says, Haman's going to be executed on the gallows that were prepared for Mordecai. Okay. All right, so finishing off chapter 7. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. And when the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, will he also assault the queen while I am in the house? As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, look, gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who stood on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath was subsided. Oh, such irony. Oh, such mastery of getting the wicked to fall and the righteous to survive through this process. All right. So the king arose from the banquet of wine in his wrath out to the garden. Most likely the king went to find the palace guard. So here they are. They think they're safe in the queen's quarters or the queen's banquet hall. And so it's just the three of them, or they're wine stewards and, all that kind of stuff. But he's going to go find the palace guards out in the garden. I need you to come in right now. I've got Haman in there and he's done. Right? So he's probably going out there to find them. And then Haman, because now they're alone, I don't think they're 100% alone. I think there's probably servants and other things, other people in the room, but they're alone in the sense the king's gone. So Haman stood before Queen Esther and began to plead for his life. So Haman knew, it says, he knew the king had evil planned against him, meaning, I put evil in quotes there, because taking out wicked Haman, I wouldn't necessarily say was evil, but that's what he considered to be evil. And Haman also was shrewd enough to realize that if the queen requested for his life to be spared, that the king could possibly relent and let Haman continue to live that day. Okay. So Scripture does not record at all how Esther responded to Haman's pleading. Doesn't say, no, you're done. She doesn't say that. She said, well, I'll think about it. Nothing is recorded here. Her any words that she may have spoken or didn't even speak are not recorded. But it seems unlikely that she would have been moved by his request, his selfish request for mercy that would, in all estimations, he didn't deserve. Right? He's trying to kill her people. He was going to kill her uncle, whom she clearly loves, or her cousin, whom she clearly loves. That was his plan earlier today. So more than likely, little need for offering grace to this wicked man was probably extended, but she's kept clean. We don't know anything about what she said or didn't say, so her integrity, her character is at the top level of everything in the story. Number 5, when the king returned to Esther's house, he found Haman fallen or collapsed across the couch where she was sitting. May have had his head in her lap or doing some kind of thing where it's very close contact, inappropriate, begging mercy from her. But what the king sees is an assault on his wife when he walks back in. Okay. So the king interpreted Haman's physical attack of pleading for mercy as this assault, either physical or sexual, like he's going to kill her before he gets killed, or he's going to, king saying, you're going to violate my wife? You're going to, what are you doing here? So it further ensured that his immediate execution was going to happen, right now. And so assaulting the queen was really equivalent to an assault on the king himself and a complete breach of royal protocol. I don't care who you are, a man does not touch the queen. It's it's a complete breach of protocol. So the king sees that, and it seals the deal. If there was any doubt in the king's mind or anybody else's mind that Haman would die this very day, seeing him stretched across the couch with his wife made sure it was going to happen instantaneously. So number 7, Haman was immediately taken into custody by the king's guard, which is why he went to the garden in the first place, and they immediately cover his face. Okay, I assume they bagged him. I probably put a bag over his head would be my guess, but they covered his face, and Haman's arrest sealed his fate. So the king ordered the guards to have him executed. King's command immediately on the spot that was going to happen. And so the guards covered Haman's face, for he was no longer fit to look upon the king or queen with his eyes. He's not even fit to look upon the palace that he had once had free access to come and go from. He was not, his eyes would not see this. He had to be covered because he was fully disqualified, fully unfit to look ever again at royalty or the royal palace or anything that the king had in his possession. So number 8, Harbona, which we could find from chapter 1, verse 10, one of the 7 eunuchs that are referenced there. He walks out, and I think without, I think very, very, I don't know what the right word is, not sarcastically, but just like, ooh, look here, king. Look at the gallows right there. Haman's house is just outside of the king's courtyard. And look at that 75-foot tall impaling execution stick that he has prepared for Mordecai. It had no purpose a few minutes ago, but now I think it has a purpose. So the king likely didn't even know by this is all in one day's event, that Haman had come earlier in that day to request to kill Mordecai. But now the eunuch says, hey, Haman built this gallows to kill Mordecai today. What do you want to do with it? And so, yes, the same Mordecai that reported the assassination plot for the king and saved his life a year. Haman wanted to kill Mordecai. That same Mordecai who saved your life a few years earlier. What do you want to do with Haman and the gallows? So the king seized on this ironic opportunity to have Haman executed on the very gallows he had planned to execute one of the king's most loyal subjects on. Okay. All the irony. God loves to tell a story. Okay. Haman was executed as ordered, and this assuaged the king's wrath against Haman. Right? He's like, he's dead. I think I can go back to my day, and I think I'm satisfied. Okay, so the antagonist of our plot here has been caught by his own wickedness and executed in perhaps one of the most ironic ways we could ever even imagine. I mean, he's gone in on the morning thinking he's going to execute his chief prime enemy, and he gets executed the exact same way that he had planned to destroy his enemy. He's the one that was exalted, and Mordecai is raised up, and Haman is brought to the very dungeon of and basement level of humility and then killed for his wickedness. However, the decree to annihilate the Jews remained in force even though Haman was dead. This did not solve the problem. Haman's death was necessary and justice in part was served, but it doesn't change the fact that the Jews, including Queen Esther, are targeted and by royal decree to be killed in about 10 or 11 months. Okay. So because the laws of the Medes and Persians that we keep referencing cannot change, the threat against the Jewish people is far from settled at this point. Mordecai, Esther, all their people are still in grave danger. And in less than a year, Haman's decree, though his dead, would still be in force. And so this tension of the story is not completely resolved to this point. We'll see that next week, chapters 8, 9, and 10. We'll see how that all comes about, and we will see, as we kind of talked about at the very beginning, opening section of Esther, how we're going to see Mordecai, not just Esther, but Mordecai will be elevated to the highest position in the kingdom. Once again, Joseph and Daniel and Mordecai, the most unlikely people in the world, somehow keep rising to the top of these pagan Gentile empires when their people are taken captive in them. We'll see all that start to unfold next week. It really is. The story just continues. It gets even better, I think, in some ways. The end of this is how do they fix the problem, and how is it that Mordecai and Esther, two Jewish people of very, they're descendants of David, or they're descendants of Jews, but they are, unremarkable except the fact that God chose them for such a time as this, as is mentioned by Mordecai of Esther. Right? So anyway, we'll finish off for tonight unless there's any questions, and then we'll come back and finish Esther next week. Yeah.
Okay, so since that was Haman
Yep.
that used the seal to set the stage for all the Jews to be killed, why couldn't the king just say,
Because he gave him his royal signet ring, meaning he's basically dissolved himself of any responsibility, but he's given by fiat the authority of his ring to Haman. So whatever is stamped in the king's signet ring means it has the full authority of the king. Okay, he should have kept it for himself. He shouldn't stamp any decree or order that he didn't approve of or he didn't write and sign, but he's letting them take charge. And he didn't even say, well, bring it to me when it's done and I'll put my finger on it. He just said, here's my ring, take it.
so in those days, not a single law could ever be changed?
Not for the Medes and the Persians, correct. Now, that's not true of other empires. Other empires, they could rescind orders they wanted to. But it's made so clear in all accounts of the whole Medo-Persian Empire, it's clear a law that has been issued, even by the king himself, an hour or minutes earlier, cannot be changed. Going back to Darius throwing Daniel into the lion's den, And he's like, oh no, Daniel? I don't want Daniel to be eaten by lions. I don't care if he doesn't bow down and worship me or stops praying or whatever. He's like, he's got to go. He's got to go in the lion's den. I signed a decree. He's got to go. Yeah.
So that decree that Haman,
Yeah.
right, that was for all the events to happen on one specific day.
One day. Yep. Yeah, I think it's the 13th day of the 12th month, if I recall properly. Could be off. But I know it's the 12th month. They were in the first month when he signed it. Remember, they cast these lots and said, basically, "O gods of Persia, when should we kill the Jews?" And they landed on the 12th month. And it was, but the first month is when this got signed, and that's when Mordecai saw the order. That's when Mordecai puts on the sackcloth and ashes and starts mourning, goes to Esther, or has people go to Esther and tell about the problem. So we're only about a month in at this point. There's still another 11 months, but the decree is, to all the people of the empire, arm yourself, get your battle plans ready. We are going to destroy, kill, and annihilate the Jewish people on that specific day in the 12th month.
Not the day after and not the day before.
No, one day was the only day they could do that. So if the Jews could survive until that day, and if the Jews could survive through that day to the next day, then that order would completely be null and void. It was one day out of 1 year that it was permitted to annihilate the Jews. Okay. See you Sunday or next week or whenever else. So, Lord bless you.